All right, well, hello and welcome to this mini lecture today. Today's lecture is going to cover three um, three key concepts for our unit on westward expansion. Number one, we're going to talk about the last frontier and the frontier thesis. Two, we'll talk about push and pull factors for migration. And three, we'll talk about the importance of railroads and the growth of railroads in western migration. By now, you should have done most of the reading in our reading packet for this unit, which is Go West Young Man. Most of the reading has already been assigned. We're currently working on the last bits of that. And this lecture is meant to kind of complement a lot of what is covered in the reading, though some of the terminology is not used specifically in the reading, and so it's very important that we get that down here in this format. All right, let's see if I can get this working correctly. I'm going to zoom off of the screen here in a few minutes, take my picture completely off the screen so you can see the whole screen here in a few minutes or in another few seconds. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about is the idea of a frontier, okay, and what a frontier is. So a frontier, if we look at a map of the United States here, we know that during the Civil War and prior to the Civil War, most of the population in the United States is living, as you can see with my cursor here, along the eastern portions of the United States. We have already started to see some population growth here in the far west, but most of this territory in between is largely unpopulated, at least by white Americans, okay? When we say unpopulated, or when we call this area the Great Desert, or when we talk about the population out in these areas, what we're talking about is the fact that there's not many white Americans living out there. Of course, as we know, because we've already read section 17.4 in the reading, that there's lots of Native Americans out there, okay, and they have a different idea of the way of life, or their culture is much different than those that they're going to soon encounter as westward expansion begins to pick up, okay? So when we talk about the frontier, what we're talking about is that kind of imaginary line between the populated territories and those territories yet to be settled. Okay, so that frontier is as you would imagine, kind of moving. That imaginary line will be moving, in our case here, to the west, right? And as we move west, this frontier line continues to move. Well, what happens when that frontier reaches the Pacific coast? And that's a big question here we'll try to deal with. Okay, so the guy who talks about the importance of the frontier is a guy named Frederick Jackson Turner, and in 1893 he gives a presentation that comes to be known as his frontier thesis to the American Historical Society or Association. And in that paper he talks about the importance of the frontier to what makes up the American, right? This idea of rugged individualism, this idea of constantly pushing the frontier, seeking out the American dream. And he's giving this talk in 1893, 3 years after the Census Bureau has completed the 1890 census. And that'll become really important here in a few minutes. We'll talk about what their determination was as far as the frontier is concerned. But for Frederick Jackson Turner, he knows that the frontier is coming to a close, if not already pretty soon. And I guess the questions that he is posing is, well, what's next? If the frontier has been so essential to the American character, what happens when the frontier disappears? Will it mean that the character, the American character that has come to define, several generations now, will that disappear? Will that change by necessity? Will there be new frontiers? And that'll be something that Americans will soon have to deal with as we come close to the turn of the century, 19th century to 20th century, and we move into the period of American imperialism. And we'll get to that here before too long. But for now, this idea of a frontier thesis is being talked about, okay? And the idea of a closing frontier as we see westward expansion start to come to completion or come to fullness in the West becomes an important concept to keep thinking about. So where are these people moving? They're moving to the Great Plains, right? Let me see if I can fix what I've got here on the screen. Okay, sorry, I'm bouncing around a little bit. I'm still kind of getting a little bit better familiar. Here, okay, that's good enough for now. So where a lot of these people are moving as they move west is to what we know as the Great Plains. It was often referred to as the Great American Desert, right? This idea of a desert being barren land where there's no one living, a whole lot of nothing, right? In reality, what we have out there is kind of what we picture when we think of the Great Plains, right? Large expanses of grass, and at the time, herds of buffalo. Native Americans are using the Great Plains not only to live but to hunt, and so there are people there. There is life that is encountered once white settlers move there. However, occupying that territory has always been a challenge, right? And it's now, since we have new modern tools, right, like steel-tip plows and more modern farm equipment, modern for the time, of course. American settlers are able to transform the Great Plains into useful agricultural land, right? Getting through the tough prairie grasses to the fertile soil beneath, right? What are some of the other challenges of the Great Plains? Long periods of drought. How do we get water to these farms in order to irrigate the land? Well, for some, that'll mean digging wells, drilling into the earth, and using windmills to drive pumps, but that's expensive, and a lot of settlers don't have that kind of money to invest in those technologies. Eventually, the government will get involved in damming rivers to pump water and move water into farmlands. So what we see during the 1870s and through the 1890s is a period of transformation on the Great Plains. The Great Plains are moving from being the Great American Desert to an area where there's going to be a great deal of settlement, right? A great deal of homesteading, as the government has offered land to settlers at a very little to no expense to them. We'll start to see large-scale agriculture as big, large-scale business farming moves in and buys up a lot of that homesteaded territory to turn into these massive farms. And by 1890, as I said, alluded to before, the U.S. Census Bureau will deem the frontier closed on North America, or at least in the United States on North America. And that'll open up a lot of questions for Frederick Jackson Turner and those that adhere to his frontier thesis. Okay. Well, let's look at what's pushing or pulling these people to the west, right? And when we talk about migration, we have to talk, it doesn't matter if it's migration within the United States or migration in some other country or on some other continent or between countries. We have to talk about push and pull factors, right? Push factors are those factors that are pushing people to move out of one area. Those are usually negative things, right? And factors that are pulling people into a new area. And those are usually positive things, right? Push factors and pull factors. Well, for American westward expansion, the push factors are going to be growing population in the east. Cities are getting bigger, which leads to difficult living conditions. and worsening economic prospects for people, right? Particularly following the Civil War. The Northeast, the industrial center of the Northeast, while it is experiencing a somewhat of a boom in the years following the war, there's also a lot of people moving in there, both through immigration, migration from the South, freed slaves looking for opportunities. And so with these growing cities, we see, because they have a lack of infrastructure, which we'll talk about in a future unit when we get to urbanization, we have difficult living conditions, and people are going to be looking for something better, right? How do we carve out this American dream? Well, the Homestead Act is the answer for a lot of people. So what is pulling people to the West? Well, 1849, we get the beginning of the California Gold Rush. That will lead to the discovery and mining of other precious metals, copper, silver, the Black Hills that we read about in the reading, portion of the reading on Native Americans. The Transcontinental Railroad, with the passage of, in 1862, of the law which authorizes the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. The government attempting to solve the, quote, Indian problem, right? How do we corral these Native Americans into areas that they won't become a problem for white settlement in the West? And then, of course, we mentioned the Homestead Act, which provided cheap land for people and an incentive for people to move. So these are the push and pull factors. We could probably expand this list to many more, but these are probably the big ones and the ones that are most important to remember at this point. Okay? Moving forward, and we'll kind of pick one of those out of the pull factors, and that is the growth of railroads. Okay? So we have a couple maps here up on the screen. This first map only shows the eastern parts of the country. Why? Because this map is talking about 1850 to 1861. And that's pretty much where all the railroads exist in the country at the time. And we see most of those railroads are in the Northeast. You know, when we studied the Civil War a couple of units ago, we talked about the importance of railroads as a real advantage for the Union. Well, we can see that on this map here. By 1860 to 1870, into the last years of the 19th century, we see an explosion of railroads throughout the country, and that's what we see here on this second map. Not just throughout, continuing to grow throughout the eastern parts of the United States and in the South, but also in the West, right? And that all begins with the Pacific Railway Act and the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. So what does that mean for Americans and Americans moving out west? Well, three big things, right? This expansion of railroads leads to a national unity that didn't exist before, and economic growth potential that didn't exist before, right? First, it accelerates or helps accelerate westward expansion, right? We're going to fully occupy now all of the land holdings of the United States. It provides opportunities for those living in the East that maybe couldn't afford to carve out any property ownership. It provides for those people to go out and seek what we commonly refer to as the American dream, right? Property ownership, determining one's future and the future of their families, securing economic stability, those types of things. And probably most important, and where we'll wrap this whole discussion up, is through specialization and interdependence. The growth of railroads, beginning with the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, allows for specialization, meaning areas of the country can specialize in the production of certain goods. Because railroads allow for interdependence, right? No longer will you live in an area where everything you consume is produced within close proximity to where you live, right? And that's how Americans had lived for generations before. Now certain parts of the country can specialize in certain areas of production and put those goods on railroads and send them off to other areas of the country, and in those trains they'll bring back the goods from other parts of the country.